Welcome to Dynasty Life. Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. And I'm joined again today by my guy, Scott Boulanger, aka Jax Falcone of the Undroppables, of the Undrafted. If you've been tuning into Dynasty Life since the get-go, you've seen my guy Scott over here multiple times because he always brings the heat. And we got to start out today. Usually I'd let people plug their stuff, but they all know who you are already.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Jaxon Smith-Njigba, we finally had like the ultimate spike week. He basically looked like 2021 Cooper Kupp out there. Went absolutely nuts. The game was great. The Rams and Seahawks went to overtime. The Rams, of course, won. A beautiful pass by Matt Stafford, Demarcus Robinson, another touchdown. But the story for us in Dynasty and in Redraft really is JSN. No DK Metcalf, and JSN goes absolutely nuclear. This was the sort of spike week that we had sort of dreamed of last year when he came in the league. We, of course, had to deal with a somewhat disappointing, reflective to his dynasty price and his redraft price. It was a disappointing rookie year. It wasn't like a historically bad rookie year like some people want to have revisionist thinking. But my question to you is this a one-off game, or is this a sign of things to come with JSN over the second half of the season?
I think it's probably more of a sign of things to come. I mean, obviously, when Lockett and Metcalf and JSN are all out there, it becomes a little bit of a touch squeeze, right? When one misses, the other two generally eat. So it's kind of been that way for the last 2 years. But JSN, yeah, you're right. Last year, he was hurt to start camp and never really got off to a good start. He's been up and down this year. I mean, if you remember early on, he had a big game, then a nothing game, then a big game, and we're kind of like, wondering which one it was. And another big game for him here. I think, he's the type of prospect that, as we look at him going forward, I just think he's pretty rock solid in terms of what we can expect from him for his career. He's going to be a slot, volume slot player that, is capable of big plays as he proved this past week. So, I think you asked me for some buys in Dynasty. I think he's a buy. I think the main reason that he's a buy, even though he's a young player, a lot of times you're looking to maybe buy some older players on the cheap for their stretch run in Dynasty. I think for JSN, for me, it's like, I think he's actually below his value, or his value is below what I think it is, or whatever. You know what I mean? I think he's still a pretty good buy at this particular point. So yeah, I would be kicking the tires on JSN and seeing if I can get him.
Yeah, I love where you're at, and I think I'm in complete agreement with you. And I think what's interesting is you bring up the big game earlier in the year, and I remember that one as well. I was stoked for that one, but that was sort of like the PPR machine JSN game where it was like 16 targets, 12 catches, and it was that. I mean, that's great. We're not complaining. That game was like a 20-something point score. Didn't score in that one. But what's interesting about this one, 25 yards per catch, and also he had a couple of plays where he was. I think there was like 2 of them where it was called back on a penalty. So it could have been 200 plus yards. So for me, like, I get it. It's been a slow drip with JSN.
Yeah.
That could also be this coaching staff sort of figuring out what their offense is. I think Ryan Grubb is smart. And I think it's sort of like, how can you put this one away? And I'll also say this one to you. Like, I love seeing this sort of a week heading into the bye week, because they're going to say, like, look what worked for us. We play San Francisco and Arizona coming out of the bye week. Like, I love that one. And I'll say, like, do you think maybe some of this with JSN last year, certainly some of this year, nobody talks about it, but he dealt with injuries both at Ohio State, and then he had that surgery in the preseason. People never talk about that. It's like that's completely forgotten in his career trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, especially as a rookie, coming in, it's hard to get on track. He's had some, like you say, up and down. It's been tough. I just think I'm betting on talent and betting on the role. I looked at it today too. Like his ADOT has been like, basically 10 or less his ADOT was over 20 yards this past week, which is a little bit of an outlier. So I think, looking at the big plays, I think is not something I'd be predicting going forward, but I mean, he's been getting pretty consistent targets, and I think that can continue. I think he's a pretty good player. Again, I wouldn't try and vault him too high, but I think his price tag is good enough where, especially in PPR formats, you're at least tethered to some floor with him because he's going to get targets.
No, I love it. I think we're in complete agreement. Here's another one where I want to get your opinion on. This is a player that I recommended as a buy high on another show that I recorded. I recorded with our guy Andrew Cooper today. So Coop's our boy. Shout out to Coop over at Fantasy Alarm. I'm doing some podcasting with him with Dynasty Trades in 5 guys. We're a little redraft in 5 this year.
Redraft in 5, very good stuff.
And Coop and I appreciate that. Coop and I, we both had a couple of buy highs this week for a redraft context, but like the two of us, we had a great podcast, and this will be fun for us to do sort of this coming off season as well, where we drafted the 2024 class versus the 2023 class. And it really Galaxy Brain. We had some really good calls in that, and also some calls I bet we wish we could redo. But one player that we were both like sort of excited about, but not over the top about, was Zay Flowers. And Zay Flowers, like the last 4 weeks, has been 19 points, 22 points, 18.5 points. And then yesterday or on Sunday, depending on the time you're listening to this podcast, he gives you 5 catches, 127 yards, 2 touchdowns. But it was sort of the way he did it. It was like you think about him as this, just like JSN, this PPR machine. But like that touchdown was so nasty. Cuts to the sideline. Almost every single player is going to go out of bounds and take the yards. 16 seconds on the clock. And Flowers just turns on the Jets. I think that the Dynasty marketplace is a little bit low on Flowers. What are you at on this? It's sort of a big 2 in Baltimore. It's almost like a big 3 now with this recent production with Flowers.
Yeah, I think your trade window was like as soon as they signed Deontay too, like that was probably the moment because you would have had this week too. But yeah, I think there was probably a little bit much to do about nothing in terms of Deontay cutting into Zay Flowers. I think Deontay is going to cut into everybody else a little bit more than he's going to cut into Deontay. I mean, excuse me, into Zay. You know, Zay's also a big play player, like really, really lethal with the ball in his hands. Unlike, JSN, really, they're completely different in that way. But yeah, I think Zay Flowers, greater than sign JSN and Dynasty for sure. But yeah, I think you missed your window because now it's hard to get them. I mean, if you're holding Zay, you do not want to trade him away.
No, I agree with you. And it's sort of like, I think that the market in the off season, there was a lot of like smart people not us, but there was a lot of smart people like redraft people who were really fading Zay. And I think it's sort of like a cautionary tale that you don't know how these guys are going to develop, especially when we have these offensive coordinators that we don't have a full story on. Like we knew Todd Monken was good, but it's sort of like because he's smoking that Monken, the guy, it's like the offense takes a step forward. The tight end position becomes less important. And Zay Flowers takes this big step forward. So, like, I think there's a lot of cautionary tales there. I'm still kicking the tires on Flowers. I think he's a really difficult person to rank. I think, like, if we had, I know you got Alan Soslowski coming on your show soon. If we had, like, Alan Soslowski, we had Chalk over at the Undroppables, and the two of us, and we all did, like, put our heads down without talking to one another and did our own wide receiver rankings, I think we'd be in a different place on Zay Flowers. I think he's one where he's sort of like difficult for people to rank right now. And I think you can take advantage on that because I don't think it's like a static ranking. Like if I tell you got to go trade for CeeDee Lamb right now, despite the injury, or Nico Collins, despite missing some time this year, like everybody is going to kind of rank those guys in a certain spot. When it comes to like the JSNs, the Zay Flowers, I think there's variance with the way people view them. And you can take advantage of that, especially if you're in multiple Dynasty formats. You kind of agree on that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think Zay Flowers now, for me is like top 15 or so wide receiver in Dynasty. I mean, he's in that realm. I mean, because would you rather have him or Chris Olave?
Flowers all day long.
Right? It's like, I have him ranked ahead of him, and it's like, Olave I think still has it, but boy, oh boy, just a tough run out. You can bet on talent with him, but I don't want to be Brandon Ayuk hurt now or Zay Flowers, easy Zay Flowers, so I think a lot of the guys that were sort of ahead of him, at the beginning of the year, he's passed. So I think Zay Flowers is certainly comfortably there. And really with the situation, what's going to change? Maybe Derrick Henry retires or something, if ever, the machine, but he's going to be attached to Lamar for as long as I can, foresee.
Yeah, and I think you nailed that one. It's sort of like the legacy rankings. There are several guys like on Player Profiler right now that we have ranked ahead of Zay. And we've always been sort of, I would say, aggressive with Zay. That was a guy like we always had him ahead of like Quentin Johnston. We had him ahead of everybody but JSN heading into last season, like in terms of the rookie wide receiver rankings. Had him ahead of Addison. So it was really like, but when I look at it and I see guys like Olave, guys like DJ Moore, sort of like the legacy guys ahead, like if you heat check the Zay Flowers manager with a Chris Olave trade offer,
no chance.
They're going to say no.
Yeah, right.
But I think there might be a counter there. Some guys think they're going to be smart on that one. Like they're
like
the
even
same
what
age.
about Tyreek Hill? Like, I mean, I think Zay Flowers over Tyreek Hill. I mean, you know, just because it's going to time out on Tyreek here pretty soon, and Zay's got a long career ahead of him.
Here's one for you. You saw it earlier in the year in terms of the new role. Obviously, he's going to return. We think he's going to return next year to something similar that we saw at the beginning of the season. So you saw like Rashee Rice take that step forward. Like Rashee Rice, Zay Flowers. You've got to go Zay Flowers ahead of Rashee Rice because of the right now factor. Do you have to, or are you sort of in that like, oh, I don't know. That's one where I'd really think about it.
It's close. I've got him back to back in my rankings, ironically. So, you know, it's a decision that we can talk about, right? In other words, you know, if someone sent you that, you know, you'd have to think long and hard. And actually, there was some dynasty game theory I'd like to talk about. So, you know, one of the things I think that a lot of the dynasty players should be considering right now is how to manage injured players. And if you're a rebuilding team with healthy players, you can take on injured players. So if I'm a not a playoff team and I have Zay Flowers, I can go to the Rashee Rice manager and say, hey man, Rashee and Zay, let's work something out. And I don't have to make that deal 1-for-1. I can make that deal and get profit because they're competing. I'm not. They need Zay. You know, they need production this year. So this year's production matters to them. It doesn't matter to you. Matter of fact, I would argue that not having production helps you if you're playing in a max PF league. So I think those trades are the trades I'm looking to make, but I also want to make sure that I'm getting the profit side of the deal, you know, because why would I just do it even and just help someone for free? You know, so making that Zay Rashee Rice deal, I'll take on Rashee. Let's talk about what I'm getting paid for my troubles, you know?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to handle injured players. We're going to reveal some of Jax's trade targets. We're going to talk about some changing values at the quarterback position and a lot more after we take a quick break right here on Dynasty Life.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back to Dynasty Life. Theo Gremminger with the great Scott Boulanger, aka Jax Falcone. A lot of people listening to this on the Player Profiler Podcast Network also are listening to the Undrafted, all the great stuff you're putting out with the Undroppables. But some of the YouTube audience might not necessarily be familiar with that show. Let everybody know sort of what you're doing this year, where they can find your show, and what you have on tap.
Yeah, check it out. The show is The Undrafted. It's a dynasty show. We do a lot of other stuff, of course. We're a little bit crazy, but you know, basically it's a dynasty game theory show. We're always trying to figure out the best way to play the game of dynasty, and it's fun as hell to do so. So
no, for sure. It's in my weekly rotation, one of the best dynasty shows out there, one of the best fantasy football shows out there, really. Even if you're not a dynasty manager, you're going to pick up some good stuff there. But when we're talking about dynasty, like Scott Connor has also talked about this one. I've sort of always believed in this one, where holding the injured player, unless you're in a rebuild, it's a very tough decision. Yeah. And a lot of times it's sort of like you're assuming that a player comes back the same if you're holding them and you're sort of like in a quasi contender type mode. So it's always a weird one. We don't want to be too like short-term thinking in Dynasty.
Right.
But there's something to be said about these continually making these trades. I know Scott Connor's been all about this one. So sort of like you talked about this before, I'll say earlier in the year, I made that trade where I traded Puka Nacua and a third to get Nico Collins. Now, for a few weeks, I felt like the greatest thing on earth.
Right.
And then I've had to deal with some injuries, but I'm going to get Nico back and I'll make a run in that league. But at the time, it was like, okay. And then that's a trade where after 1 or 2 weeks, you don't necessarily, that's not even available to you when Nico starts doing what he's doing this season.
Right.
So like, kind of like how deep do you go with that one? Like, are you holding any Brandon Ayuk shares? Like, where are the kind of guys you're looking to pivot off of that are dealing with injuries right now?
Yeah, I'll do it. I mean, it's obviously team specific too. Like, there's certain teams where I've got enough depth where I don't need to, make that deal if I'm holding a Chris Godwin or something. It's like, I lost Godwin. That's not good, but I've got enough to fill in. I'm going to go from there. Hopefully Godwin comes back. If I get the right deal, I'll make it. But when, if you lose a guy like a Puka, a Nico, or, AJ Brown, hurt, what's going on? I mean, obviously we'll find out more. I don't know if it's come out yet. I haven't noticed. But by the way, while we were recording, Dak's going to miss several weeks, it said. I don't know if you heard that.
Who's this is an interesting one. Is it going to be Cooper Rush, or you think will we see a little Lance?
My goodness. I mean, dude, crazy, right? I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. I would imagine at this point they would actually try and play Trey Lance, I would think. Certainly I would play Trey Lance. We know what we have in Cooper Rush. This team isn't like, hey, hold it down. We just need a couple of wins till we get to the playoffs. This is everything is on fire. So let's, see what we've got in this kid and go from there. That seems like, because he's the only one that could be worth anything in trade or for any other reason, right?
So now you have a dynasty game theory discussion.
Yep.
CeeDee Lamb. Okay, obviously dealing with a shoulder injury. So you've got the injured CeeDee Lamb, and then you've also got the quarterback where it could be a complete disaster. I don't think it's going to be Miami level, but it could be kind of Miami-ish. It's certainly going to make every single Dallas weapon lose value over the next few weeks because of the quality of the offense. This team could be just headed south.
Yes.
If the two of us are like guessing on who the next quarterback in is, that's not good. So, CeeDee Lamb, this is one where this is like what a turn of events for CeeDee Lamb managers, including myself, because I have a ton of Lamb. So we get the Lamb comes out of a bye week and gives you nearly a 40 burger. It's sort of like, hey, we're back. We're fully back. This is it. We got the league winner again, same as last year. And then you have the catastrophe with a shoulder injury, plus now losing the quarterback. When you start talking about CeeDee Lamb, Jax, this is not a Brandon Ayuk. This is not a Chris Godwin. This is a premium dynasty asset.
Yeah.
What are some scenarios that you're willing to pivot off of CeeDee Lamb and take maybe a 90 cents on the dollar type deal in order to like survive? Are there some trades out there that you're going to consider when it comes to CeeDee Lamb? If you're right in the thick of things, you've got a win now roster, and now you've lost sort of like the engine or one of your engines in CeeDee Lamb.
I think it's very important to be patient. I when we're looking at this, it's like, if your team is like 5-3, maybe you shouldn't be doing anything. Maybe you should kind of see what the hell happens here. I mean, if you think that, because you lose CD, your team is fucked, then your team is screwed anyway. So don't double down on it, lose value, lose CD, lose the league still, don't win anything. So I would be patient unless I'm a surefire, like I'm going to, I'm like 8-0 and I'm like, but even then, be patient, see what happens. You might lose some more players, you make this trade, then all of a sudden you want to make sure you're conserving your resources to act at the appropriate time. And I would just wait. So for me, a little bit of patience pays, because if you're a player away, that means you're not a player away. That means you're more, you know what I mean? You're not that good. If you're solid enough where you can withstand it, then that's a team worth investing in, but I do so a little bit later. So generally speaking, if you need to hold on by making a trade, that's usually the worst reason to make a trade. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of looking at it. Like, I think usually, like in most seasons, you can say, hey, I'm a contender because my team scored a ton more points, and my record is reflective of that. Or maybe my record's not quite as good, but I have all these victory points. Certain leagues, I handle it in different ways. This year, there's a little more context because let's say I'm the fourth highest scoring team, but I have Nico Collins or
Yeah.
potentially Christian McCaffrey and Nico Collins on my
Right.
bench. Like
Right.
there's a lot of context this year, but I think you nailed it. I think that's really a great way of looking at Dynasty in terms of trading off an asset to stay alive, and also whether you should consider trading a future first, which is some players are completely averse to doing that
Yeah.
ever. But I think they're sort of tied hand in hand. The biggest mistake you can do, and sort of it's what you just said, is doubling down and trying to like force it. It's like a poker hand where you don't know you have the best hand, but you force it all in. You're like, this is it. And then all of a sudden you lose your chips. With Dynasty, like losing CD Lamb and being too reactionary with it could hurt you for several seasons to come. So
yeah, I'll give you an example of a deal that I would consider because it would make more sense. Like, okay, someone says, Garrett Wilson and like Aaron Jones for CD or something. You're like, okay,
yeah,
I'm only tearing down slightly from CD to Garrett Wilson. Maybe that's not even a tear down in future years. We don't really know. At least it's close enough where, they're like, screw it. I just got CD. I'm not winning the Aaron Jones team that's getting rid of him. Those types of deals, if they're there, sure. I'm not going to say don't do that because it actually does help you in two ways going forward. You're a contender, good trade. I'm just talking about like you're saying, like, oh, trade my first and this, that, and the other for, you be careful with, overextending yourself at the wrong time.
Let's talk about another wide receiver. And this is one that's kind of difficult for people to gauge. Obviously, the scoring is not what we want in terms of consistency. We've seen it in a few weeks, but it's been sort of a big letdown when it comes to the Arizona Cardinals in general. But Marvin Harrison Jr., when we talk about guys with like trade equity, like he's still worth a fortune in terms of the Dynasty trade market. It's not like people are giving up, but this has been a difficult one for Marvin Harrison Jr. managers because it's just the lack of consistency. Another dud yesterday. A week ago, we had a really strong week. Where are you at with Harrison Jr.? Let's say you're a team that's 6-2, 5-3. You're up there in terms of scoring. And is there potential pivots where you say, okay, I could pivot to maybe this guy in a pick, like a potential tier down, so to speak, that's actually a tier up? Are there pivots with Marvin Harrison Jr., or are you just digging your heels in and saying, you know what, this is a player that I can't trade right now? It would just be bad process. What's the Dynasty theory with Marvin Harrison Jr.?
I mean, Lord knows I've been wrong a lot. But I would say that I would be more than happy to trade Marvin Harrison because I think his value, like you say, is still top 5 wide receiver. And so if you're getting top 5 wide receiver value for a player that is not a top 5 wide receiver in terms of fantasy points and might be down the line, I'm not saying he can't be, but the target earning and the efficiency is not great. I think he's a bit of an outside X, and that's a tough prototype to be dominant in this era. So yeah, I mean, it's less likely that he all of a sudden is getting 10, 12 targets and doing that for you on your team. So I would say, yeah, sure. I did trade him. I traded him this was a rebuilding team, but I got Rashee Rice, Trey Benson, and a first and 2 seconds or whatever the heck. I got a big old haul for him, including an injured player. And I feel great about that, because I've got another elite receiver to replace him. Maybe not as good, maybe as good. I don't know. I don't know who's going to score more fantasy points over the next 3 years, Rashee Rice or Marvin Harrison Jr. I don't know. So to get profit on a player like that, I would do that all day long. Just make sure you're getting requisite value because he's still a top 5 wide receiver. So don't sell short.
Yeah, I agree with you. Let's pivot away from Marvin Harrison Jr. Let's say that we're trading him. You brought up a guy like a Garrett Wilson. That's easy.
Yep.
What about a Brian Thomas Jr., who certainly struggled yesterday, but are you taking like a Thomas Jr. plus, or do you feel like that's sort of like not necessarily making your team better? You're acquiring an asset that has less trade value, even though we've seen like a lot of very promising things scoring wise. Is that a trade you're willing to make right now when it comes to BTJ, or is it more like, you want a guy maybe a little bit older that sort of like we know what we're getting type situation?
So Brian Thomas Jr. is like valued well ahead of Zay Flowers right now. Is that true? So like,
yeah,
right. So I mean,
I think so. I would say he's like a wide receiver 1 Flowers is like somewhere in that mid wide receiver 2 range.
You know what I'm saying? So I think if I were doing that, I'd maybe want to get Zay Flowers plus more than Brian Thomas plus. Like if I can get more, I would want maybe even Odunze, because I think Odunze and Thomas for me are close, but I think, Odunze plus more, so I mean, it's tough. Yeah. I need to see the trade, right? I mean, cause every deal, look, if I said this last week on my show, I say it all the time. If you're buying, so if someone's coming to me buying Marvin Harrison Jr., they need to pay full price plus, right? No discounts for the person that's buying. You don't get any discounts. Does that make sense? Like, anytime someone's coming to you, hey, I want to buy Devon Achane. Well, I wasn't selling Devon Achane, so you need to make me feel like I need to sell him. So same thing with a Marvin Harrison Jr. It's not like, I need to get rid of this guy. No, you don't. There's zero reason to get rid of that guy. So if someone's coming to you and buying and saying, I'll give you Brian Thomas plus, it's like, well, plus what? Right.
Yeah.
Now, maybe at the end of the day, like you're saying, and as I said about Rashee Rice, maybe Brian Thomas outscores Marvin Harrison over the next 3 years. That's possible, but his value does not suggest that it should be a close trade. It should be a little bit of an advantage for the seller of Marvin Harrison Jr.
And I think if we're just thinking in a short-term window, depending on the way this season ends, I think there's a chance that we're seeing Brian Thomas Jr. going ahead of him in redraft next year.
Wow, that's great. I love this.
I think like BTJ over the second half of the year, obviously yesterday, maybe he shouldn't have even played. He's banged up,
that's right.
and that didn't have the targets. But I'm sort of like, I've seen the spike week ability.
Yeah.
I don't know which way that's going to end up. So yeah, I'm with you. Like Marvin Harrison Jr. is definitely a one that is sort of like a difficult player for you to value, difficult player to rank at this point. He's still ranked very highly, but it's sort of like, it's not, especially when you consider the context of the class where we've seen Malik Neighbors have like all these weeks where he's over 25 points. And even now he's like such a target magnet, even with like I talked about him struggling and he gives you 14.9 points yesterday. So like,
but this is why I love having friends, because like if I were in the shoes of the guy who has Marvin Harrison, someone came to me with BTJ trade, I'd like call you and I'd be like, hey man, what do I do? You know what I mean? Because you sort of want to talk through it. And then you mentioned like, hey man, he could be, higher in the redraft. You say that, I'm like, damn, that's probably true. That could be right. So like, yeah. So I really like the way you're thinking it through. And it's hard because sometimes you just look at value, you look at, there's a little bit of fear, right? You're like, I traded Marvin Harrison Jr. What'd you get? Well, just a, wide receiver 2 in a couple seconds. It's like, what'd you do that for, you idiot? So there's a certain level of like, you don't want to be the idiot,
I still believe that there's going to be in almost every single dynasty league. This is always like why you want to shop a guy around to multiple managers and not just hone in on a single trade target. Because I do believe that there's going to be, in most dynasty leagues, there's still multiple managers who are willing to overpay for Marvin Harrison Jr. right now. They said, this is like a blip in the radar. We've sort of seen it with guys like Drake London, where if we wait and we're patient, we're going to get that elite wide receiver production. The profile is too big to fail, and it's not going to fail. We've already seen the guy have spike weeks. It's sort of like just how consistent does he end up being a guy who's like a top 5 wide receiver at some point in his career soon on, because that's the way he's valued. Right. Let's pivot over though, because let's talk about another wide receiver who's sort of coming on, and not necessarily like the guy I thought we'd be talking about in week 10, but this is one where I turned down a trade in a dynasty league last week where I was offered a decent amount for Cedric Tillman. I turned down 2 of them actually. I have all this Cedric Tillman, and it wasn't like I was like, I do all kinds of waiver wire content, but Cedric Tillman's week that he popped was a week where in redraft, Tillman was dealing with guys like Jalen McMillan when Godwin went down, Juwan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall when Brandon Ayuk went down. And then in Dynasty, like, some of the leagues I'm in, like FFPC, Tillman to start the year was not even rostered. So you're able to pick him up on Dynasty rosters as well. But this is really pretty consistent. He's 22 points per game over a 3-week period. And we're seeing the like 25% target share, like a 35% air yard share. And it's not like this is some guy off the street. We're not talking about like a Jalen Coker undrafted free agent. We're talking about a 3rd round pick, played in the Southeastern Conference, big, not I've seen the Nico Collins, like, it's not Nico Collins. Nico Collins is easily, a tenth of a second faster in the 40, like better athlete. But Tillman's not unathletic. He's athletic, can jump. Where are you at on Tillman? Do you think this is a situation where, because I've seen two sides of the fence here. A lot of people recommend him as a dynasty buy, and there's some people saying this is the cash out. He's a dynasty sell. Where are you at? Is it somewhere in between? Like, where are you at on this one?
Well, I think it's both, right? Because I tried to buy him in the Dynasty Game Theory Invitational, and JJ Zacharyson was selling him. And we had a really cool trade that was almost done. And it was, I was giving Jonathan Brooks and I was getting Pacheco and Tillman. But I was also ceding a little bit of trade equity to the likes of more than a third. And I was like a little uncomfortable. And I was like, man, I'm not so sure. And, I contacted, Adam Hutchinson, my doctor friend. And I was like, is Pacheco coming back? He's like, I don't think so. He goes, that's a tough one to come back from. So it's a win now team. So I said, maybe not, Anyway, long story short. And then JJ sells him for a second. And I said, great trade. So great. I was unwilling to pay a certain amount for him. And then he was willing to sell. I thought I would have sold for that too. I wouldn't buy for an early second, 25, but that's what he got for him, mid, early, whatever. It's not going to be a late second. I was like, that's a great trade.
Yeah.
Now, when you ask me, is Tillman the real deal? I think he's the real deal. I think he's closer. This is the question. Do you think he's closer to Travis Fulgham or Puka Nacua?
I think he's. I don't want to get quote like to anybody producing the show. I don't want to get quote tweeted on this one.
Right.
But he's closer to Puka Nacua than he is to Travis Fulgham.
Okay. See, I thought he was a little bit closer to Fulgham, but I'm not saying he's Fulgham. He's the
didn't
real
have
deal.
The pedigree. Fulgham didn't have the pedigree.
Right.
The day when you talk about day two picks, let's just to take a step back, like Tank Dell, 3rd round pick, Josh Downs, 3rd round pick, Deontay Johnson, 3rd round pick, Terry McLaurin, 3rd round pick. I didn't say a guy in there that's like, oh my God, that guy changed my dynasty fortunes. Right. But I just said 4 guys that it's not out of the realm of possibilities that a year from now, Tillman is not valued sort of in the way that we value a Downs, maybe a Dell. It's like it's there in the wheelhouse. So that's like with Fulgham, it was always like this is like, and anybody out there who didn't get a chance to live the Travis Fulgham lifestyle, it was like 1 month of bliss, and then completely disappeared off the earth. So that was a really fun one a few years back. It's always like the waiver wire wide receiver is usually somebody you want to fade in general in fantasy because most wide receivers get drafted. But with Tillman, it's a little funny because he was playing behind Cooper and now he's in the Cooper role. Yeah. So I'm doing kind of mental gymnastics here, but 3 weeks with this sort of sample size.
Yeah. No, it's
and
great.
He's got the Jameis trust where Jameis will just throw it up to him. So I think we're there. Let's pivot over. Let's talk about the quarterback position because you are a huge New England Patriots fan. And you're also somebody who really, I think, is able to get a gauge on quarterback values and where we should be ranking these guys. We talked about this a little bit in the pre-show, and we're not going to talk about every single quarterback, but I think like right now, most people, when they're ranking dynasty quarterbacks, it's sort of like a top 6. Would you agree on that? It's a Lamar and Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, and then the 2 guys who don't really score the fantasy points, but we know they're great players in CJ Stroud and Patrick Mahomes. Can we agree that's sort of the top 6?
Yeah. I think I'm on the national Drake Maye capitulation tour, and I'm happy about it. I said it the whole time. Like I couldn't lose. I could not lose. As a Patriots fan, I said Drake Maye is going to bust. So if he doesn't bust, I win. If he busts, I win. So the only thing I have to do now is capitulate, and I've got the guy. Look, after seeing Drake Maye play at the NFL level and also his athleticism, which I was warned about his athleticism, and those who were talking up his athleticism were right as rain because he's really fast. And he's actually, the thing about it is, I watched this past week's game, and his pocket maneuverability was way better than I imagined it would be, at the NFL level, to be honest with you. He's so good. His arm is electric. He's got really good downfield velocity. He's got great downfield touch. I mean, he's just really, really good. Playing with zero weapons, like 0.0 weapons, like nothing. Kayshon Boutte is out there on key downs as his number one. So this will only get better for Drake Maye. I am crazy as to how high I'm willing to put Drake Maye in my dynasty rankings at the quarterback position.
I think you're absolutely right. And this is one where, I player profiler people out there, like just sort of like how the sausage is made. Like Matt and I talk about our dynasty rankings a lot. Like this is like something where it's not just like, oh, we're just going to throw it out there and just rank. Like Matt and I talk about the dynasty rankings a lot. When there feels like there's a necessary change, we're doing it. I know that you guys did a lot of work with our like rookie guide this past year. We're really happy to work with all the guys at the Undroppables on that. Like you and Chalk crushed it, but like you see, it's like a real process here. But like with Drake Maye, it's sort of like, how can you not be this enthusiastic about it? You pretty much nailed the argument. He's got the rocket launcher arm. He's got the missile launcher. He's accurate. He's mobile in the pocket. And then it's the rushing upside is scary good. So for me, it's sort of like the argument to rank a Kyler Murray ahead of him that ship has sailed.
Yep.
Kyler's not giving you rushing production. And when it comes to youth equity, like Caleb Williams was the number one pick, but you talked about the weapons. If you gave Drake Maye like just two of those guys in Chicago, let alone DeAndre Swift, who's playing very well, like I think like the production would be much better. And Caleb's not scoring, and we can blame the coaching staff, but at the end of the day, it's on the player. Here's one. Okay, so Drake Maye, and then the two guys that I think are very insulated are Joe Burrow and Jordan Love. Drake Maye, Joe Burrow, Jordan Love. Where are you going if you could pick one for your dynasty team?
Well, it's probably Joe Burrow. I think it's still Joe Burrow because, I think he's just excellent. So, he's going to score fantasy points and he's also excellent. I do think that, Drake Maye, in a couple years might be able to outscore him, but I don't know if he's as excellent. But look, Drake Maye's right there, I think. And that's crazy because he was, a ways down the rankings. But yeah, if I were to look at it right now, and I'll do so, I mean, I would say Drake Maye. Yeah, I mean, it's hard with Drake Maye because, the team is so bad, but he looks so good. And I think I would take Joe Burrow, as mentioned. The Jordan Love versus Drake Maye situation, I think Jordan Love has his own sort of, question marks, turnover. Look, he's so prolific. I said he's prolific and erratic. I think that's what Jordan Love is. And I think he's going to continue to be prolific. And so for fantasy, it's obviously a good thing. As long as they keep winning, he'll keep his job. Isn't that always it though? Right. It's like, Jameis was scoring fantasy points for us and then he was benched, so it's not always just the fantasy points. You also have to look at how long they're going to be able to keep their job. I think they're all pretty well insulated for sure. I think Drake Maye is very, very insulated because until they turn the team around, they can't really say we're losing because of Drake Maye. So until they can say that, which is going to be at least, a full year from now, that they can say that. I don't even know how the hell they're going to put that together for next year. But, I think he's the real deal. So, yeah, Jordan Love, we talked about it earlier. I think I might lean Drake Maye over Jordan Love in Dynasty, which is kind of crazy feeling.
I have them back to back. So we're not that far off. I'm higher on Jordan Love. I think, like, for me, Jordan Love can make some throws that others can't. He's so insulated with that contract. And also I've seen a heavy duty amount of touchdown throwing over the last two seasons. Like, nobody gives you more touchdown passes collectively over the last two seasons than Jordan Love. And I'm even concluding our guy, Joe Burrow, who's, just had a 5 spot yesterday. So like Joe Burrow's right there. He's about as insulated as it gets. Curious your thoughts on Bo Nix. This is one that's obviously not even on the show sheet, but sort of your enthusiasm level. This is another guy who's sort of doing it. Better weapons than May, but it's not exactly like we're talking about, the LA Rams over here with wide receivers talent. Like Cortland Sutton's a capable player, but besides him, there's a lot of question marks on the offense. Yeah. And we've seen multiple games now where Bo Nix has sort of put him on their back. Obviously Baltimore laid the hammer to him, but they're 5-4 this year. They're in the thick of the playoff chase. And a lot of it goes with Bo Nix's play over the last 5-6 weeks.
Yeah, I think, look, rookie quarterbacks tend not to be great, right? Like you can trace this back a long way. Like what Jaden Daniels is doing is not normal, for him to be that efficient. So I think all these guys have afforded themselves pretty well, especially Nix and May. I have a team with Nix on it, and it's great because, while he's sort of learning on the fly, he's scoring you fantasy points because of the rushing upside as well. So he's actually been startable in a QB2 spot in Superflex. So it's been great. So I do think he's going to keep the job for a couple years too. It's going to be both of the juries on those two players is going to be out, after 2 years. You're going to get a Daniel Jones runway for sure on both of them, and I think they're better than that. But yeah,
I remember we talked about it this past offseason about like, we were, I think, a little bit ahead of the market on Nix. We weren't like down the table for him, but there was no quarterback that was more connected to the head coach's success than Nix. So like Sean Payton, if they have a winning record this year and they go out and get him some weapons, the mobility again with Nix has been very, very impressive. Like top 5 rushing. We saw him catch a touchdown pass yesterday. Like his athleticism has really translated to the NFL, maybe better than I anticipated. So like we're sort of right there. Want to get over to the running back position. So we're sort of splitting hairs here on the elite of the crop, like the top 4, but we're obviously seeing Devon Achane make his big ascension. He's been sort of the Tua Tagovailoa. That's the guy that's benefited the most from Tua returning. Devon Achane, sort of like all the usage is there for a RB1 rest of the way type season. He's catching all the passes. Sort of our top 4, like we've always been with these guys, but it's like the Robinson, the Hall, Gibbs, and Devon Achane. Has anything sort of changed with like your top 4 with those guys? Is there pivots to be made by moving off of one to another? Like, are you trying to pivot to Achane with any of those other guys? Like, where are you at?
I like all 4 of them. I've got, shares of all 4. And when you look at your lineup and you see him, you're like, that looks good to me. Achane has been probably the guy we should have been trading for along the way because, I think there were some people who are down on Achane, but obviously the offense matters. Achane's been great. I have Jahmyr Gibbs as my running back 1 in Dynasty. He just feels rock solid on that team. I mean, there's just no issues there. Bijan 2, and then Breece 3, but man, Achane is starting to make a case for that RB3 spot too. So I look, if anybody wants to pay me profit to go from one to the other, I'd take it.
I think you just nailed it. It's profit off one or the other. It's trying to find that guy with the personal preference who really wants the one. I'll say this, like the Achane starting to get more receptions than Breece Hall. That scares me a little bit. Like last year, I had a team that was in a somewhat of a rebuild mode. And I said, I'm pushing the chips out. I traded a bunch of guys, got a bunch of draft picks, but I made one big trade where Breece Hall, I traded him to the Devon Achane manager. Achane was banged up at the time, and I got Devon Achane and a 2024 first in a single QB league. And that turned into Brian Thomas. So that was Brian Thomas and Devon Achane for Breece Hall, and now that team is like very much contender. So I'm in the mix this year already. So I'm sort of with you. I feel like when it comes down to it, it's like the fear level. The guy that I'm almost most fearful of not having on certain teams, like I have a ton of Achane, and anybody who wants the receipts, like the two of us have been on Devon Achane since the beginning. Like you can find a lot of people who are fading that profile. We were embracing that profile. There's receipts on both this podcast and your podcast with like our enthusiasm for him. So yeah, we were real smart on that one.
I will say the moment that Miami pushed the button for him, he became like, I was like, I'm in.
That's it.
That was it. That was it. That was a match. I had the same offer. I had a Breece Hall for Achane and a first, and I dragged my feet and it got rescinded before I accepted it. So I lost that trade as well. So I could have had that trade. Sorry, excuse me, messed it up.
Sliding doors right there. One player that I want to get your opinion of, and I think I'm actually very high on this player, but it's such a weird profile that I want to make sure I'm not making a mistake. Tyrone Tracy is one that I've been, I have a ton of exposure to. We all talked about him as sort of like this is one where if you're a redraft manager or a best ball manager, it's like you should have a dynasty team for guys like this, because I think like the dynasty marketplace, this guy was almost like universal. There was a lot of people that were on him. I wasn't the only one, but there was a lot of smart people sort of on the profile. But now that it's there and he's gained all the value, it's sort of like, are we too enthusiastic? Let's say the positives. Elite athlete. We've seen the production big time on. We've seen the fantasy scoring. We've seen him overcome a not a locked in guy, but a guy that the coach liked in Devin Singletary. Motor. You know, like that's a Brian Dable guy, and Tracy took it over. So also the positive being that he hasn't played the position that long. So there's a lot of positives. Okay, negative. He's an outlier in terms of age. I don't really care about that, but some people do. But he's 25. It's not like I have a 22-year-old. So he's older. Like, you know, you see some guys like, oh my God, he's older than Javonte Williams. Okay, but he's better than Javonte Williams. So like, am I overrating the profile of Tyrone Tracy to be this enthusiastic about him? I think this could be like an Aaron Jones situation, a 5th-round pick that sort of sticks for us for 2-3 years, helps us win. Or am I like, this is an opportunity to really, really cash out? You drafted this guy in like the 3rd round of your rookie draft, Theo, and now you could maybe get 3 times that amount.
I think you're right both ways, actually, right? Because, you know, I think he is the real deal. I think he is going to, you know, secure that job for this year for sure, which is a great stretch run player. Not a great offense, but he catches passes. He's involved in that pass game. I think he's tethered to opportunity there. He's also a big play player because he's electric. So I don't hate rostering him and being, you know, high on him down the stretch. I think also selling him at a high value right now while it's still there is worth it. Hey, I had a question I wanted to circle back to about Breece Hall. What are the odds that they just run this thing back with Aaron Rodgers next year and go, you know, into the Stone Ages for one more year? Or do you think that they make a change at coach, a change at quarterback, and that unlocks, you know, Breece Hall because they play at a faster pace with a more modern offense?
Well, I think the fact that you're even asking those questions about the insulation of the value is scary to me. I think Aaron Rodgers, is back as quarterback for the Jets next year, because I think what's happening with them is they just beat the Texans. They're pushing the chips in. They traded for Devontae Adams, and they're going to go for it. And in the AFC this year, they might have enough to make the playoffs. So you're sort of like, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but like I always love when we do this, because we'll talk about like, we'll give like a little sneak preview of like the 2025 class, but we don't go too deep into it. But like, I'll say this, like there's 2 quarterbacks I like. I like Cam Ward a lot. I like Shedeur Sanders. And then like Nussmeier, maybe Jackson Dart. Because Jackson is a stud. But there's 4 of them. There's not like last year where every single my point with the Jets is the Jets might box themselves out of one of those guys if they make the playoffs, because again, it's not that great a quarterback class. I think like Milrose coming back to school, and there's like a lot of these guys like, do you want Carson Beck? Like, come on. I know you're not, that's Carson Beck. These guys are not my kind of guys. So, it's the right year to avoid drafting a quarterback, because I think they're going to get boxed out of those guys. And it's sort of like they'd have to trade considerable draft capital to go get one of those guys. Yeah. And I think it's a year where you're not going to see a quarterback selected at the 101. I think this is a year where like Travis Hunter is going to go 101 unless people are out of their minds. So that's sort of like where I'm at with Rodgers. So I think I think Rodgers will be back next year attached to Hall, and a 2nd-year Braylon Allen. Second-year Braylon Allen, when he's 21 years old, is going to command a little bit more than this year. So I'm sort of like, if I can pivot off of Breece Hall to Devon Achane or Gibbs or Robinson, I'm probably doing it. And that being said, Breece Hall for sure is a top 4 dynasty running back to me. Like for me, Kenneth Walker, probably 5.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, that's sort of where we're at. And there's a pivot argument that I've seen some very smart, sharp, high stakes managers doing, like sort of a pivot where they can get a lot more on top of like a Ken Walker for a Breece Hall. And they've considered doing that. So I don't know. Yeah. It scares me more than Devon Achane, which is crazy, because you would think like the Devon Achane profile would scare me, but I don't think so. I think like the low BMI, it doesn't matter when a guy catches passes like this, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, for me, it's like, the situation around both those players is a little bit scary. Tua and his, concussion issues are obviously very, very scary. And when he's not there, unless they find a adequate replacement, it's scary. And what's crazy is Aaron Rodgers being there is scary for Breece Hall, just because they play at such a slow pace. And for whatever reason, the offense just doesn't have any sort of punch. I mean, look, I don't know. Maybe they changed offensive play callers. It got a little bit better in 1 week, but we'll see how it goes down the stretch. I mean, that offense sometimes is tough to watch. It's sort of just stuck in the mud and seems very repetitive. They don't seem very creative, unless I'm watching a different Jets game. You tell me.
No, at least we're happier about Garrett Wilson than the last time we talked when
Totally.
he wasn't scoring. Oh my God, what a catch. So I want to get you out of here soon. Let's talk about some trade targets.
Okay.
I'll throw out one for me. Chase Brown. I'm kicking the tires on for Chase Brown because I think this is one where, like Tyrone Tracy, it's a guy who's a day 2 pick. People don't necessarily look at him as a long-term insulation guy. I think he's electric, and I think that the Bengals showed last offseason that they don't want to use draft capital on a running back. They signed Zach Moss for cheap. They went with Chase Brown. So if they improve on Zach Moss, it's still not like completely scaring me off. So I think I'm getting more than a 1-year window with a very explosive player now in a situation that can score a lot. Anything to add on Chase Brown?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's playing out like we kind of foresaw, which was, a 50-50 Zach Moss start, and then sort of slowly going to Chase Brown. Well, obviously, Moss being dinged up kind of accelerates that a little bit. I think, Chase has been pretty bad in the pass game. I mean, I don't put everything in PFF, but his pass block grade is like negative numbers. I've never seen. It's all red, but he's been very efficient. I think he's like 54% success rate versus 36% to Zach Moss on running plays. So he's been way more successful on the ground. 3.3 yards per carry for Moss, 4.6 for Chase Brown. So Chase Brown is certainly the more electric player in that offense. If they can just sort of manage some of his pass downs enough, that's really the question, is whether or not he can play on pass downs, effectively to protect Burrow and to make plays in the pass game. He's been kind of shaky there. That's the only concern I've got.
Yeah, I'm with you. And we both were on Darnell Mooney. Why don't you make the case of trading for Darnell Mooney? I mean, the guy's scoring points. So make a little bit more than the guy's case. Yeah, there you go.
That's the case. Dude's scoring fantasy points. But I mean, really, it's a consolidated target tree there. I mean, we know exactly what's going to happen. It's Mooney. He plays like every down. Mooney in London, every down. Pitts, every down. Like those three guys get everything. And we weren't exactly sure that was the way it was going to go. I mean, we weren't exactly sure what the hell was going to happen with this team. In week 1, I was talking about how Cousins was going to be benched because, he looks so bad. And not just, in his play, but also physically. He wasn't moving very well. He actually is really looking great lately. So that's enough to keep the chains moving and have the uncertainty of Michael Penix. They've got certainty right now at the quarterback position. They've got certainty in target share, and his cost is super low, although it's creeping up, right? Because people now know. But you could probably convince, especially a manager who's got a losing record with Mooney. I'm sure he would maybe think, what, how long is this going to last? And I'm sure you could pry Mooney away from a lot of managers for sure.
Yeah, no, completely with you. And he's second in the NFL in catches over 20 yards, and he's already got a career high in touchdown catches. This is shaping up to be like a huge year for him. You talked about Najee Harris. Why don't you share? I love that you were on that one because I think he's going to get a free agent contract, sort of like with Montgomery a couple years back.
Yeah, I mean, and we were a little worried about Jaylen Warren and Cordero Patterson cutting into his workload and maybe him sort of being a 30 or 40% player with those guys kind of, taking a little bit of the majority from them, for themselves, as a tandem. And, Cordero's been out and hurt and not doing anything. And Jaylen Warren's been hurt and actually outperformed by Najee. Najee looks really good out there. I don't know if y'all saw that the most recent game, but he looked really good. He looked powerful, fast, quick, explosive. He's trusted. So I think at the end of the day, I think they value what he brings to the table. And if he's going to be healthy, which he appears to be right now, then he's a weapon out there, and he likes to score touchdowns. They like him around the goal line. And, I don't think anybody's too excited about rostering Najee Harris. So again, there's a discount sort of built into his cost where someone might be like, oh, finally I get to sell this stiff that I've had on my roster for a while. And he might give you value for, like you say, years to come, maybe 2 or 3 more years for sure.
I have a couple rosters where I tried to sell them for a while,
and
now I'm like sort of happy that I have them.
Me too.
It was a funny reason why I didn't want to sell them, because I had a lot of Jaylen Warren and I was willing to trade some Najee Harris.
Yeah.
And then it was like, I don't want to give you both, so I'm just going to hold the package. And Pittsburgh never added a competition to the two of them, so I've sort of just been holding it. And now it's sort of worked out where you're able to use them. So I think it could end up being a blackjack split next year, where Warren might actually get the usage in Pittsburgh if Najee Harris moves on. So you might end up with a guy who's in Warren in sort of like the role we expected for Warren this year, and then Najee lands on like Kansas City next year as like the guy who falls in the end zone. So
by the way, if this were the undrafted, Najee Harris hold the package would have been the show title, just so you know.
And shout out to you guys. You guys do the best. Still the best podcast title of the year was Kamani Vidal Ass Mass, when you had, I believe that was Thor Nystrom on your show. That was a banger. That was a bar. Give us people a couple of your, like, you don't have to go into too much context here. I'll say for me, I like kicking the tires on Jake Ferguson because I think he's going to get a ton of volume. He's completely boring, but I don't think he cost me a lot. And he's got 18 targets over the last 2 weeks. And then there's a chance that if CeeDee Lamb, I've seen a lot of people sort of like Jalen Tolbert, if CeeDee Lamb misses time, like I actually think it would be a lot of Jake Ferguson. So why don't you share a couple of your veteran trade targets? And these are specifically for contending dynasty teams.
Well, how about Russell Wilson, right? I mean, right now, if you're in a super flex league and you need a quarterback, if a team is rostering Russell Wilson, they can't be holding on for too much longer. I think he's a great buy. Geno Smith is another quarterback that I think is worth looking at. You heard about Najee Harris. I think Kareem Hunt's a sneaky buy. And I
bought him last week.
There you go. I think Kareem Hunt's a sneaky buy for the reason that I mentioned earlier. Adam Hutchinson, and a private text to me, said that he's very, very concerned about Pacheco, not because he knows inside information, but just because of the nature of that injury. Tough one to come back from. He might come back, right? He certainly could come back and steal his lunch. But the way that Kareem Hunt's been playing, it may be hard to just play him off the field entirely. So who knows? Maybe he has a little bit of 50-50 and touchdown upside, even if Pacheco is able to make it all the way back. But there's also a chance that he doesn't. And, someone could be looking to get off Kareem Hunt before the music stops, and you might be able to buy cheap. So I think Kareem Hunt's a good one. You mentioned Cortland Sutton. I think, he's up and down. You're going to have to take some near goose eggs with Cortland Sutton, but he's throwing touchdowns. He's out there doing it all, baby. I also think Jacoby Myers, who's basically locked in as the number one target for an NFL team, barely, but an NFL team. It's kind of gross, but again, if you're looking to buy cheap, I think one of the harder ones to buy is Terry McLaurin. But there's definitely going to be some guys who are maybe selling on, sort of value and not on, whether or not he's going to perform this year, if that makes sense. And you might be able to get him for a second or maybe 2 seconds or something like that. I think if you can buy a Terry McLaurin for that type of price tag right now, he's a smash. And tight end, you mentioned, I think Mark Andrews is still a buy because I think people are really, really nervous about him. His snap share has been going up. His targets have been going up. Maybe he was just really having a hard time coming back from the injury. And then, I had Taysom Hill on here, but then Dennis Allen got fired. Not exactly sure what the new staff is going to do with Taysom Hill, but what was he like? Tight end one, right? I mean, he's got touchdown upside, even if he doesn't do anything all game. Just they use them in goal line packages. So for those reasons, I think Taysom Hill is a sneaky buy as well.
I love it. This was so much fun. Every time you're on the show, you bring the heat. I love a lot of your trade recommendations, and I love how you're thinking outside the box with a number of those guys. So if you have a contending roster, I think like a lot of people try to wait till a little later in the year. I would kick the tires on some of these guys now. You never know when you get that proper value. And if the manager turns you down, they at least know that trade is sort of on the table. Maybe you get the trade done next week just by having great communication. And speaking of great communication, Jax Falcone, Scott Boulanger, let everybody know where they can find your work, what you have coming up.
On Twitter at Dino Game Theory, on the interwebs at theundroppables.com and on your podcast feed everywhere The Undroppables can be found. Just search The Undroppables or my show, The Undrafted, which is conveniently located right here on the Player Profiler Network.
You can listen to Dynasty Life and listen to the back to back. Highly recommend all the work you guys do over at the Undroppables. Big shout out to all the great people you have working over there. We love having the connection that we have between Player Profiler and the Undrafted, and the Undroppables, and make sure you're listening to the Undrafted every single week. It's absolute fire. We're dropping a Sonic Truth this week on Friday. It should be dropping on Friday. Matt Kelly and I are going to be joined by Alan Soslowski. Should be a lot of fun. And make sure you're tuning in to School of Scott. That's my other podcast. Got to go over to the Fantasy Points channel for that one. We're going to try to bring you a Dynasty Life every week, every 2 weeks sometimes. We'll see where that thing goes. But week 10, time to get those wins. Let's go win some Dynasty championships.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.